10 years ago, top college football teams would play 2 to 3 tough games per regular season. But with super conferences aggregating the top programs and nil plus the transfer portal dispersing talent, college football programs are now playing schedules almost as difficult as the NFL. These programs have it the worst this fall, as these are college football's top 10 hardest schedules for the 2026 season. Related, college football's top 10 impact freshmen for 2026. Key games: versus Florida State, 9-19, versus Georgia, 10-10, at Tennessee, 10-17, versus Texas A&M, 10-24, at LSU, 11-7. Kalen DeBoer is already feeling the heat in Tuscaloosa for not living up to Nick Saban's lofty standard, and 2026 is going to be extra challenging for the third-year Bama head coach. The difficulty of Alabama's schedule comes down to a month-long gauntlet in the middle of the season. Starting October 10th, the Crimson Tide host Georgia, play at Tennessee, host Texas A&M, and play at LSU, 4 teams that will likely all start the season ranked in the top 25. Key games: versus Oklahoma, September 26th, at Alabama, 10-10, versus Florida *, October 31st, at Ole Miss, 11-7, versus Georgia Tech, November 28th. Georgia starts the season with 2 cupcake games against Tennessee State and Western Kentucky, but there are no gimmies once the SEC schedule starts. Between hosting Oklahoma, traveling to Alabama, playing Florida in Jacksonville, and playing at Ole Miss, Georgia's schedule is doggone hard. Key games: versus Clemson, September 5th, at Ole Miss, September 19th, versus Texas A&M, September 26th, versus Alabama, November 7th, versus Texas, November 14th. New head coach Lane Kiffin has preached patience, but ask any former LSU head coach how long the honeymoon period lasts in Baton Rouge. The Tigers start the season under the lights versus Clemson and 2 weeks later play at Ole Miss in Kiffin's return to Oxford and what will be the most anticipated college football game in recent memory. Hosting Alabama and Texas in back-to-back games in November rounds out a schedule that will make Kiffin earn his $91 million contract. Key games: at LSU, 9-26, at Alabama, 10-24, versus Tennessee, 11-14, at Oklahoma, 11-21, versus Texas, 11-27. Texas A&M's 2026 slate is going to make fans miss being in the Big 12 Conference. The last 5 weeks of the season are an absolute murderer's row of opponents between Alabama, South Carolina, Tennessee, Oklahoma, and Texas. The Aggies will really need the 12th man to make it to the college football playoff for the second year in a row. Key games: versus Oklahoma, 9-12, versus Penn State, October 17th, versus Indiana, 10-24, at Oregon, 11-14, at Ohio State, November 28th. Kyle Whittingham is going to have his hands full in his first season in Ann Arbor. Michigan's second game is against an Oklahoma team that made last year's playoff. In October, the Wolverines face Penn State and defending national champion Indiana in back-to-back weeks. But the end of the season is where things get really brutal, as Michigan has to play the 2 best teams in the Big Ten on the road. Michigan plays at Oregon on November 14th, and then 2 weeks later, the Wolverines head to Columbus for the game against Ohio State. Yikes. Key games: versus Alabama, 10-3, at LSU, 10-17, versus Oklahoma, 10-24, at Texas, October 31st, at Ole Miss, 11-27. After going just 1-15 versus the SEC in his first 2 seasons in Starkville, head coach Jeff Lebby will be lucky if he can win 2 conference games this season. The biggest reason for that is an October slate you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. Versus Alabama, at LSU, versus Oklahoma, and at Texas. Having to finish the season against arch-rival Ole Miss is the final blow of a brutal schedule. Key games: at Michigan, 9-12, at Georgia, September 26th, versus Texas *, October 10th, versus Ole Miss, 11-14, versus Texas A&M, November 21st. Think Oklahoma misses playing Kansas and Iowa State as an old member of the Big 12 yet? The Sooners head to Ann Arbor to face Michigan in the Big House and then have arguably the toughest back-to-back games in the country, at Georgia and versus Texas in the Cotton Bowl. And 2 of OU's final 3 games are against teams that played in last year's college football playoff and are expected to make the 12-team field again. Ole Miss and Texas A&M. Key games: at Texas, 9/12, at Indiana, October 17th, at USC, October 31st, versus Oregon, 11/7, versus Michigan, November 28th. Ohio State has been criticized in recent years for having a soft schedule, but 2026 isn't one of them. The Buckeyes go on the road to play at Texas in Week 2, and the Buckeyes' Big Ten schedule is loaded. OSU has a 3-game gauntlet in which it plays at Indiana, at USC, and hosts Oregon at home. And of course, the season ends with the game versus Michigan. Key games: at Utah 9/12, versus Georgia 9/19, at Texas A&M 10/3, at Texas 11/21, versus LSU November 28th. New Arkansas head coach Ryan Silverfield might regret leaving Memphis after this fall. Not only is he inheriting a team that went just 2-10 last season, he has also been handed an insane Year 1 schedule. The challenge starts with a road game in Week 2 at Utah to face a Utes team that won 10 games last season. A week later, Arkansas welcomes the mighty Georgia Bulldogs to town. A trip to Texas A&M's Kyle Field is never easy, and finishing the season at Texas and versus LSU is punishing. Key games: versus Ohio State, 9/12, at Tennessee, 9/26, versus Oklahoma *, 10/10, versus Ole Miss, 10/24, at LSU 11/14, at Texas A&M, November 27th. If Texas is going to win its first national title since 2005, the Longhorns will have to earn it. Texas plays 4 teams that made the 2025 college football playoff, and the gauntlet begins in Week 2 when the likely preseason number 1 team in America, Ohio State, comes to Austin. Texas also begins SEC play with a road trip to Neyland Stadium and the Red River rivalry versus Oklahoma. And finally, UT's last 2 road games are at LSU and Texas A&M, 2 of the toughest places in the country to play. Related: college football's top 10 Heisman Trophy favorites. Related headlines: CFB rumors. Insiders predict if Tennessee Volunteers will land 5-star recruit. College football's top 10 impact freshmen for 2026. Brendan Sorsby's 4 options after NFL supplemental draft rejection, including a season in UFL.